Hello, my name is Kristen Bolden, and I'd like to welcome you to The Other Side of History. Now, in this talk, I would like to talk on work and whether work produces happiness. Now, how many of you believe that happiness is a byproduct of work? I think we would all agree that work is necessary. But does work produce happiness? Now, in this talk, I would like to focus on the thought that perhaps one of the most permanent joys found in this world today, it is found in some profitable work. Now, there are some who seem to regard work as an affliction, but work is not an affliction, and we are not to pity ourselves if we have to work. Now, the ones in life that should be pitied are those who have no purpose. Work, it produces a purpose, and there can actually be no happiness without purpose. Christ himself said, "My Father worketh hitherto, and I work." End quote. It is because of Christ's work as Creator that we all are able to live and to move and to have our very being. The sun and the stars and the sky are because of Christ's work. The acorn that becomes the huge oak tree, and the beautiful red and pink that's painted on the roses, the fruit hanging on the vine, and the rain that waters and irrigates the fields, all are because of God's work. Every process of life is only able to carry on because God is constantly at work. The Bible tells us that he that keepeth Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. End quote. Yet the thinking that those that work should be pitied, it even permeates literature. We actually feel sad when we read stories of the farmhand that had to work hard in the hot sun all day long, or the woman who had to cook and clean all day long. Many farmers, they have failed to secure adequate returns from their land because they have undertaken the work as though it was a degrading employment. They do not see that there is a blessing in it for themselves and for their families. All they can discern is a brand of servitude. Their orchards, they're neglected. The crops are not put in at the right season, and a mere surface work is done in the cultivating of the soil. Many are unwilling to earn their bread by the sweat of their brow, and they refuse to till the soil. But the earth, it has blessings hidden in her depths for those who have the courage and the will to persevere and to gather in her treasures. I believe that those who strive to possess a piece of land in the country and have a comfortable home are like kings and queens. Now, everyone is searching for contentment, but it is a plant that does not grow in some delectable mountain. It is low along the ground, and it is accessible to all. Contentment is found in the accomplishment of little tasks that are well done. The key is to put your whole heart and soul into what you do, and to do what you enjoy and have a heart and soul for. Now, there is need for doctors and lawyers, bankers, etc. in our society. But don't think that the labor man is not able to be blessed in his work. The labor man normally has more opportunity for physical activity, and those that have no time for physical activity should be actually pitied instead of being envied. Those who do not use their limbs every day will realize a weakness when they do attempt to do exercise. The veins and the muscles are not in a condition to perform their work and to keep all of the body in a healthful action. Every organ in the system, it must do its part. The limbs will only strengthen with use. It is important for those who are desk workers to do moderate exercise every day to give strength to the muscles. The farmer, he actually has an advantage because he does active exercise every day in the open country air, which most likely is much cleaner than the air that is found in the city. Such exercise, it gives health to the liver, the kidneys, and lungs, and it gives strength to perform their work. Now, your lungs, deprived of clean air, it's like a hungry person deprived of food. We can actually live longer without food than we can without air. Clean air, it is the food that God has provided for our lungs, and we should never regard it as an enemy, but as a precious blessing from God. There has been a view that the labor man is not as important as the educated man. Education is seen as for the gentleman. Now, this view is that the gentleman should not have to do manual labor. It is the laboring class that is meant to do the work for him. The hard work is for those who have failed in their attempt to get a soft job. Now, those with this view have even thought that the laboring class is not as fortunate as them and has not had as good luck in life. So, is soft work better than hard work? Now, only you can answer which man is truly happier. There is the man at some luncheon who stands around first on one leg and then on the other leg, trying to keep his dress shirt from creeping up and eating and drinking until his insides are paralyzed. He has this silly grin on his face. It's kind of frozen, actually, on his face. But really, is he happier than the working labor man? Many complain not because they do not have enough bread to eat, but because the other fellow has cake to eat. But who really is healthier, the bread eater or the cake eater? Now, there is a saying, and it says, "The happiness of mankind consists not in the arriving, but in the traveling." End of quote. Now, Erik Satie, he was a French composer and he was a minimalist. Now, I'm not a minimalist. I do like to have nice things that I can afford that are within my means. However, it is good to not put too much value on things. If the New World Order has its way, all of our things are going to be removed. We will own nothing. And then they even have the gall to say that we are expected to be happy about this. Anyway, Erik Satie, he lived in a simple one-room apartment, which was a good distance from where he worked, and he walked to and from work. Now, when a publisher offered him a certain sum of money to write a series of piano pieces that he wanted to illustrate a series of watercolors with, Satie, he refused until the publisher agreed to pay him less money. So then, at this lower fee, he wrote a long set of beautiful piano pieces. So, it's kind of funny, but it's hard to hurt a man like that when it comes to the removal of his assets. Erik Satie, he placed very little value on things. I believe that there should actually not be talk of class among them that do work. If all are honest in their work and are able to benefit their fellow man, they all do well. That is, the physician who actually ministers to the health of their patients, he does well. The preacher who inspires goodness in his hearers, he does well. The business manager who coordinates labor, he does well. The important thing is that each person enjoys what they are doing and that they do it well. Now, I would like to give a couple examples from some names in history who found their, quotes, calling, so to speak. Now, in 1757, there was a boy named Antonio Canova, and he was born in Italy. Now, his father, who was a stonemason, he died in 1761. Now, the next year, Antonio's mother, she remarried, and she gave Antonio to his grandfather, actually, to care for. Now, Antonio's grandfather was Antonio Canova, and he was also a stone cutter, like his father had been, and a sculptor. But his grandfather was very poor. Now, Antonio was weak, not a very strong person. And in fact, he was not even strong enough to do a whole lot of work. And he did not care to play with the other boys in his town. But instead, what he loved to do was to go with his grandfather to the stone yard. Now, while his grandfather was busy there cutting and trimming the great blocks of stone, the boy, he would play among the chips there. Now, sometimes Antonio would make little statues from the soft clay. Sometimes he would take the hammer and the chisel and even try to cut a statue from a piece of the rock. So the boy, he showed much talent and skill, and this was, of course, to his grandfather's delight. Antonio will be a sculptor someday, said his grandfather. Now, in the same town where Antonio and his grandfather lived, there was a wealthy count. Now, the count liked to have grand dinners for his rich friends in the surrounding area. Antonio's grandfather had a job working in the kitchen there at this count's house. The grandfather was actually a really good cook as well as a good stone cutter and also sculptor. Now, one day, Antonio went with his grandfather to the count's great house. Now, there were many people at this grand feast that was to be, and Antonio, he was helping to wash the pans and the kettles. And everything was going really well in the preparations until it was time to spread the table for dinner. Then there was this crash that could be heard in the dining room. And a man, he rushed into the kitchen with the pieces of a marble statue in his hands. "What shall I do?" he cried. "I have broken the statue that was to be the centerpiece on the table." All of the servants were actually afraid of the count's anger at the loss of this beautiful marble statue. Antonio, he left his pans and kettles that he had been washing, and he went to the man who had broken the statue and asked, "If you had another statue, could you arrange the table?" "Certainly," replied the man. "The statue would need to be the right length and height." "I could make a statue for the table," said Antonio. "Will you let me try?" "Nonsense," cried the man. "Who are you, that you could make a statue on an hour's notice?" "I am Antonio Canova," said the boy. Some of the servants actually knew of Antonio's skill, and they suggested that he be at least allowed to try. So since the man had no other solution, he finally agreed. On the kitchen table, there was a large square lump of yellow butter. And it was very large because it actually weighed 200 pounds. It had just come in fresh and clean from the dairy on the mountain. So with a kitchen knife in his hand, Antonio, he began to cut and to carve into this butter. In only a few minutes, he had molded it into the shape of a crouching lion. And all of the servants, they crowded around to see this beautiful creation. "It is so beautiful," they cried, "even more beautiful than the statue that broke." When the Count and his friends came in for dinner there, the first thing that they saw was this yellow lion. And all were very impressed with the work of art and commented how none but a very fine artist could carve such a figure. They thought it was kind of odd that butter was used instead of some beautiful marble, but they insisted that the Count tell them the name of this artist. The Count then had to confess that he was as much in surprise as they were. So he called for his head servant, and he discovered that it had been carved only an hour earlier by a young boy in the kitchen. So the boy was told to come into the dining room. "My boy," said the Count, "you have done a work of which the greatest artists would be proud." Now, there were some famous artists that were in the room, actually, and they all knew that the boy was a genius. "What is your name, and who is your teacher?" asked the Count. "My name is Antonio Canova, and my teacher is my grandfather," said Antonio. So Antonio, he was invited to sit at the table, and the dinner was made there actually as a feast in his honor. The next day, the Count, he sent for Antonio to come and to live with him. And the best artists in the land, they were employed to teach him the art. But instead now of carving butter, he chiseled into the finest marble. So Antonio Canova is one of the greatest sculptors that our world has known, it's been said. This story is also a lesson in parental training. Now, Antonio may not have been raised by his real parents, but his grandparents, they played a huge role in his life. Antonio's grandfather did not leave Antonio with nothing to do, but he taught him how to work with a purpose, not in a lazy, droning way that really just idles away the time. To be faithful in our work is a duty for each one of us. Not all can fill the same place, but for all there is a place and there is a work. Now, I have one more story from history that I would like to tell you. And the story is of Peter of Cortona, who was an Italian architect, painter, and decorator. And he lived from 1596 to 1669. Now, he had been a shepherd boy, but at the age of 12, he left for Florence, Italy. Now, Peter, he hoped that in Florence, he would have the opportunity to learn how to do painting. When arriving at Florence, Peter, he spotted someone who he knew that was standing actually at the door of a palace. The boy that Peter knew, his name was Thomas. Now, Thomas was the same age as Peter, and had also come from the same village there, which was Cortona. Now, Peter, he tapped Thomas on the shoulder, and he told him that he had left Cortona and come to Florence to learn how to paint. Well, Thomas asked if Peter had any money to learn painting, and he replied, "Not a penny." "Then you can't be an artist," said Thomas. "You had better be a servant in the kitchen with me here at," and he worked for a cardinal, and the cardinal's name was Cardinal Satie, his palace. Now, here he said he would be able to find something that he could at least eat. "So, do you have enough to eat?" asked Peter. "More than enough," said Thomas. "I don't want to be a servant. I want to paint," said Peter. "If you let me stay in your room and let me have your extra food, when I become a painter, I will settle the bill with you," he said. Thomas, he thought about it for a minute and then he agreed. He took Peter up to the garret where he slept, and after a while he brought him some dinner. Now, the room was small, and they slept among the chimney pots. The only furniture was actually an old straw mattress, and there was 2 rickety chairs. The walls, they were whitewashed. However, the food was good and it was plentiful. Because they both had no money for paper and pencils and brushes and colors, Thomas, he took some charcoal from the kitchen, and Peter, he started to draw pictures on these whitewashed walls. Peter drew many figures of men and women and birds and trees and animals and flowers. Before long, all of the walls, they were entirely covered with pictures. One day, Thomas came into possession of a small piece of money, and he was able to get Peter pencils and paper and other things that artists needed. So Peter began taking walks every morning, and he wandered around Florence. He was drawing everything that he saw. He drew the pictures of the churches and the fronts of the old palaces and the statues that were in the square and the outlines of the beautiful hills. Now, things went on this way for actually 2 years, with none of the servants knowing that Thomas was keeping this border. Now, if some did actually know about it, they good-naturedly shut their eyes to it. Now, the cook would actually sometimes tell Thomas that he ate a good deal for a boy of his size, so maybe he was a little suspicious. One day, the owner, which was this cardinal, Satie, he decided to repair his palace. He went all over the house in company of his architect, and he looked into places where he had not visited these places for years. They went into the garret, where they stumbled right into Thomas's room, and they were astonished at the drawings on the walls. "What is this?" cried the cardinal. "Have we an artist among us?" The cardinal inquired as to who occupied the room, and he was told that it was a kitchen boy. So Thomas, the kitchen boy, was called. He had never been in the presence of his employer before, and he was actually fearful. "Thomas," said the cardinal, "you are no longer a kitchen boy." "Please don't send me away," begged Thomas, thinking that he was being dismissed from service. "I have nowhere to go, and Peter will starve. He wants to be a painter." "Who is Peter?" asked the cardinal. Thomas told the story, and the cardinal said that Peter was to be brought before him. However, Peter, he did not come back to his room that night. Actually, 2 weeks went by, and a search was finally made to find Peter. He was found with one of Raphael's pictures being exhibited there in a public building. Peter had asked permission to copy it, and the man in charge was actually charmed by his youth and his talent, and he had consented. So the man had even given him some food and a place to stay. So when Cardinal Satie finally found Peter, he took him in and he admitted him to the very best school of painting there in Florence, where he had now masters to instruct him. Peter worked mainly in Rome and Florence, and he did extensive paintings and decorative schemes for the Medici family. So 50 years later, there were two old men that were living together in one of the most beautiful houses there in Florence. One of them was Peter of Cortona, whom some of his contemporaries believed was the greatest painter of their time. The other was Thomas, and of them they said, "Happy is the man who has him for a friend." Now there are two lessons actually in this story. One was the diligent work and the sacrifices that Peter made to become a great painter. Peter found work to do, even in that little room in the garret. His work in that room helped to prepare him for eventually working with the greatest masters of his time. Now, Peter did not refuse the needful discipline in working, even while under not so ideal circumstances. Now, the other lesson was Thomas. His act of self-denial and kindness in helping his friend, it was very special. Thomas showed he was able to cooperate with Peter for a very worthy cause. Thomas worked with fidelity to help his friend, Peter. He showed respect to Peter's dream in becoming a painter, and he helped him to achieve that dream. However, if we are Christians, each one of us has even a higher calling than to be a sculptor or a painter, and that is found in the book of Mark, chapter 16, verse 15. And it says, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." End quote. So all of us are to work for the salvation of our fellow men. We all have been given the blessing of God, and we should respond to this goodness by our service or work in His vineyard. Now, every gift that God has given us should be employed for the advancement of His kingdom. The greatest work that we can do is in the restoring of the moral image of God in man. Only this work will give the joy and the peace that only God can give. So, to end this little talk, I want to go back to the opening question. Does work produce happiness? I believe that it does. I hope you have enjoyed this little talk. If you have, I just encourage you to click on that like and subscribe button. Leave your comments. Go back and listen to other talks in this series. For this series is on the life of Jesus Christ, and we know that Jesus was definitely the greatest of everything and the perfect workman, as we talked about in our last talk. So I just want to thank you for listening, and I'm wishing God's blessings to each one of you.